It was April 12th, 1945. The war in Europe had less than 4 weeks left. General George S. Patton's Third Army had been tearing through Germany at a pace that left even his own commanders breathless. Town after town was falling. The Nazi war machine was dissolving. But on that particular Tuesday morning, a column of American soldiers from the 4th Armored Division crested a muddy hill in central Germany, just outside the small town of Ohrdruf. And what they found on the other side of that hill stopped them cold. It wasn't a battlefield. There were no German tanks, no artillery emplacements, no trenches. It was a camp. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and scattered across the frozen ground. Bodies. Hundreds of them. Skeletal men in striped uniforms, shot in the back of the head and left where they fell. Some were piled in mass graves. Some had simply been left to rot in the open air. When Patton arrived to see it himself, this decorated warrior who had led armies through North Africa, Sicily, France, and the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, stepped behind a building and was physically sick. He had just discovered the work of Hitler's execution squads. And what he did next would change the course of the final weeks of World War II. To understand what Patton found at Ohrdruf and the dozen other camps his army would liberate in the following days, you have to understand the specific instrument Hitler had built to carry out mass murder in the final chapter of the Third Reich. By 1940, the Nazi regime faced a serious problem. As German forces swept east through Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, they encountered millions of people they considered enemies, resistance fighters, partisans, political dissidents, and entire civilian populations targeted for elimination. The regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was largely unwilling to carry out systematic mass killings against civilians. Even some SS officers balked. Hitler needed something different. He needed men with no moral compass whatsoever. Men who would follow any order, no matter how monstrous. The solution came from one of the most twisted minds in the entire Nazi hierarchy, an SS officer named Oskar Dirlewanger. He was a convicted criminal, a violent alcoholic, a man so brutal that even senior figures inside the SS found him repulsive. He had been expelled from the Nazi Party, had his doctorate revoked, and served time in prison. But he had one quality that made him invaluable to Heinrich Himmler. He had absolutely no limits. Dirlewanger proposed building a unit made not of professional soldiers, but of convicted criminals, men serving time in prison, murderers, hardened, violent offenders. He argued they would be perfect for the kind of work no honorable soldier would stomach. Himmler approved it. Hitler personally endorsed it. And in the summer of 1940, the Dirlewanger Brigade was born. What began as 80 convicted poachers, men chosen because their hunting skills could theoretically be used to track partisans, rapidly became something far darker. As the unit expanded across occupied Poland and Belarus, Dirlewanger filled the ranks with men pulled directly from concentration camps. Murderers. Men convicted of manslaughter. The criminally violent. He maintained discipline not through military order, but through beatings and summary executions. If a man in his own unit displeased him, Dirlewanger shot him. If someone grabbed loot he wanted for himself, that man died. The unit operated entirely outside the norms of warfare. They moved through villages not to fight soldiers, but to terrorize and eliminate entire civilian populations. In Belarus, they drove groups of people into barns and set the barns on fire. In Poland, they marched men, women, and children to open fields and shot them. When the Warsaw Uprising broke out in August of 1944, when the Polish people rose up against their Nazi occupiers, Dirlewanger's men were sent in to crush it. In the Wola district alone, they systematically killed tens of thousands of civilians. Not soldiers, civilians. Hospital patients were shot in their beds. Nurses and doctors were executed alongside their patients. Children were murdered in the streets. Even the regular German army was horrified. Senior Wehrmacht commanders appealed directly to Hitler to have the unit removed. Prominent SS officers described Dirlewanger's men as, quote, real hoodlums. Complaints went all the way to the top of the German military command structure. Nothing happened. Hitler protected them, because they were doing exactly what he wanted. By early 1945, as the Soviet Red Army closed in from the east and Patton's Third Army drove in from the west, the Dirlewanger Brigade had left a trail of mass graves stretching thousands of miles across Eastern Europe. Historians estimate they were directly responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 civilians in Warsaw alone. And that number doesn't begin to account for the carnage they left behind in Poland, Belarus, Slovakia, and across the Eastern Front. Ohrdruf was not a death camp on the scale of Auschwitz. It was smaller, a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp system, built to use slave laborers to construct an underground telephone exchange for the German military. But in the final weeks of the war, as Allied forces closed in, the SS guards received orders: leave no witnesses. They did not evacuate the prisoners. They executed them. Thousands of men, those too weak to walk, those who stumbled, those who refused, were shot in the back of the head and left where they fell. Those who could still walk were forced on brutal death marches deeper into Germany, left to die in the forests and on the roadsides. When the soldiers of the American 4th Armored Division walked through the gate on April 12, 1945, they became the first American military unit to liberate a Nazi concentration camp. Nothing in their training had prepared them for it. Some of the toughest combat veterans in the United States Army stood in the middle of that camp and wept. When General Patton arrived 2 days later, alongside Generals Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower, the scene affected each man differently. Bradley later wrote that he was unable to speak for a long time after entering the camp. Eisenhower sent urgent messages back to Washington and London, demanding that journalists and political leaders be brought to see it immediately, so that no one could ever claim it hadn't happened. And Patton, the hard-driving, profane, theatrical warrior who had charged across half of Europe, went behind a building and was physically sick. He then walked back out and made a decision that would echo through the final weeks of the war in Europe. General George S. Patton was not a sentimental man. He was not soft. He had driven his soldiers through blood and mud and frozen misery for the better part of 2 years. He had demanded more from them than almost any other commander in American military history, and they had delivered. But standing inside that camp at Ohrdruf, something shifted inside him. This was not a casualty of battle. This was not the tragic collateral damage of war. This was organized, deliberate, industrial murder. These men had been worked to death and then shot like animals to cover the evidence. And the people who had done it were still out there. Patton issued 2 orders that went far beyond normal military protocol. The first, he had the mayor of the nearby town of Ohrdruf and his wife brought to see the camp. He wanted the local German civilian population to look at what had been done in their name, a few miles from their homes. The mayor and his wife returned home that evening and hanged themselves. The second order was broader and more sweeping. Patton had notices printed and distributed throughout every German town his army passed through. He ordered that German civilians, the ordinary men and women of these towns, would be marched through every liberated camp in the area. They would see the bodies. They would see the mass graves. They would carry the bodies on their own shoulders to proper burial sites. He would not allow the comfortable fiction that ordinary Germans simply hadn't known. To the SS guards and execution squad members captured by his forces, Patton extended no such consideration. Under the laws of war, SS members responsible for atrocities against civilians were not entitled to prisoner of war status. They were war criminals. Patton made certain his officers understood exactly what that meant in the field. In the final weeks of the European War, The men of the Third Army processed thousands of German prisoners. But the SS guards of the concentration camps? The execution squad members caught red-handed? They were dealt with by a different standard entirely. And in the chaos of the final collapse of Nazi Germany, very few of them survived long enough to see a courtroom. As Patton's Third Army swept deeper into Bavaria and toward the Czech border in late April and early May of 1945, they liberated camp after camp after camp. Mauthausen, Gusen, Flossenburg. Each one told the same story: systematic mass murder carried out by organized SS units on direct orders from the Nazi High Command. The Dirlewanger Brigade itself, the unit that had pioneered many of the execution squad tactics used in the camps, met a very different fate on the Eastern Front. Decimated by the Soviet Red Army in the final weeks of the war, the remnants of the unit dissolved in the chaos around Berlin. Some were wiped out in the Halbe pocket by Soviet forces in May of 1945. Only around 700 men of the entire division survived the war. Oskar Dirlewanger himself fled west, hoping to surrender to American or French forces rather than face the Soviets. He was captured by French forces in June of 1945 in the small German town of Altshausen. He died in French custody shortly after, reportedly recognized by Polish prisoners of war who were being used as guards. He did not die peacefully. History had caught up with the man who believed he could operate beyond all consequences. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the war in Europe was officially over. Patton stood at the head of the most battle-hardened, most lethal army the United States had ever put in the field. His Third Army had been in continuous combat for 281 days. It had liberated over 12,000 towns and cities. It had captured or destroyed the equivalent of entire German army groups. But of all the things the Third Army accomplished, Patton later wrote that nothing weighed on him more than what they found in those camps, because it told him something about the enemy that no military briefing ever had. This wasn't just a nation that had gone to war. This was a nation that had built an apparatus specifically designed to commit murder on an industrial scale, staffed it with the most violent criminals they could find, and then tried to erase the evidence as the walls closed in. There is a comfortable myth that war is a clean contest between armies, that atrocities are the exception, the aberration, the act of a few bad actors. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade and what Patton found at Ohrdruf demolishes that myth completely. The execution squads that murdered civilians across Eastern Europe were not rogue elements. They were official, state-sanctioned, personally approved by the highest levels of the Nazi government. They were given resources, reinforcements, medals, and promotions. The murder was the policy. What General Patton understood, and what his actions in April and May of 1945 demonstrated, was that the only response to organized, systematic evil is the complete and total destruction of its capacity to continue. Not negotiation, not half measures. Removal of the threat, permanently and without apology. He forced German civilians to confront what had been done. He ensured his forces pursued SS war criminals relentlessly. And he made certain that the historical record was preserved, that journalists and leaders were brought in to witness what the Nazi regime had done, so that the world could never pretend it hadn't happened. Patton was a deeply flawed man, arrogant, politically reckless, and often cruel in small ways to the people around him. History records all of it. But in those final weeks of the European war, standing at the gates of Ohrdruf, he was the right man in exactly the right place. He looked at what Hitler's execution squads had done, and he made sure the world was never allowed to look away. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps by American forces in the spring of 1945 stands as one of the most significant moments in the history of modern warfare. Not because of the military tactics involved, but because of what it revealed about the enemy the Allied armies had spent 4 years fighting. General George S. Patton had fought across 3 continents and commanded hundreds of thousands of men. He had faced Rommel's Africa Corps, crossed the Rhine under fire, and relieved Bastogne in the dead of winter. But nothing he encountered in those 4 years shook him as deeply as what Hitler's execution squads had left behind in the camps of central Germany. He made sure they were destroyed, he made sure it was documented, and he made sure the world was forced to see it. That is not the story of a perfect man, but it is the story of the right response to an enemy that had abandoned every last principle of human decency. What do you think of how Patton responded to what he found? Was it enough? Let us know in the comments below. If you want more unfiltered military history like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that the history books leave out. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, never forget history.